Welcome to the Chase Hudson Show, a podcast dedicated to inspiring you to become extraordinary. Each week, we sit down with top-tier business owners, real estate investors, and influencers to inspire you to build your legacy. It's time to level up. All right, everyone, welcome to another episode of the show. Today we have Scott Petersen, who is the co-founder and managing partner of RevRoad Capital, an early-stage seed venture capital firm that scales founders faster. Scott is also the founder and executive chairman of Omadi. Am I saying that right? Omadi?
Mm-hmm. That's past, of course. Because,
right.
Yeah.
Former founder, and I should say executive chairman. Omadi, a cloud-based mobile platform for field services management that serves the towing, transportation, and insurance industry. So with that, welcome in, Scott.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you and hear a little bit more about your story. Well, the first thing I typically ask my guest, Scott, is to talk a little bit about your upbringing. So what should listeners know about your childhood or earlier years that helped form you and mold you into who you are today?
So I think, Chase, that upbringing is actually a bigger thing than most people want to give it credit for. We don't often have control over our own upbringing per se. Obviously, we don't choose our own parents. We don't choose where we grew up, the city we grew up in, and a host of other factors. But it is what instills the early habits, the early thoughts, and the early ideas that frame our worldview. And so when we haven't had the most significant opportunities, it's like we have to, self-choose to put, to change that paradigm. So in my particular situation, I grew up in a generation where I really didn't know anybody that was like superbly, successful. It's like there were doctors and dentists and lawyers and, people that made, more money than my parents did. But back in the 60s and 70s, America, was emerging as it was a world leader for sure, but the wealth of the world and the wealth of the U.S., it was still in process. So I can remember picking cherries when I was 10 years old. I can remember having a job where I made onion rings when I was 13 because we had to. My father was a high school AP English teacher. My mother didn't work. There were 7 of us. And so, resources were scarce. And so if you wanted anything, you had to work. Working taught us resilience, taught us how to deal with what I call the vagaries of life. The difficulties that are inevitable so that they don't crush us when they happen. If you learn, to have minor crushes, so to speak, when you're younger and as they increase and you learn how to deal with it, then things like entrepreneurship, which obviously is a difficult course to take because there is so much vagary and so much of the unknown, you can deal with those things a lot better. So I worked from the time I was 10 till I served an LDS mission when I was 19, and then came back. And I would love to have taken the traditional road of going to 4 years of college and if I chose to do a graduate degree or that sort of thing, but those really weren't my opportunities because of the financial side. So I got married. I was almost 22, and I started working, going to night school. I started in sales. I found that it was something that I had a knack for, but a knack isn't good enough. So Chase, I think about, I had one of my customers, hand me a poem that was called The Parable of the Salesman. And I never forgot it ever. I thought it was fantastic then when I read it, and I think about it sometimes still today, where it basically talked about, there came through the gates of the city a salesman from afar, and as the day went by, he sold plenty, and all the other people are gathered in the bars, having coffee or whatever else, and saying, what the heck, how does this guy do this? And so this sage who was inside said, well, while you guys are in here, drinking coffee, he's already out, working hard. And while you're sitting here with, plain clothes, he looks super sharp, and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, I thought it was flattering. And I thought that there were really two things that set me apart in my early sales career. One, I learned that no one could work harder than me. And two, no one could build stronger relationships of trust. People just weren't willing to 100% of the time do what they said that they would do. And it gave me time to learn the skill side, the product side, etc. And so really within 5 months, I became the top rep out of 225. This wasn't summer sales. They didn't exist back in the day. And that springboarded my career. I got transferred to Kansas City as a young sales manager on basically my 23rd birthday. And then a year later was made a division manager. I left and became a national sales manager for an orthopedic company, and then the vice president and general manager. So all in all, about 7 years before I started my own business in 1988.
Got it. That's great. Well, it sounds like really great values learned from a young age, working hard since you were 10, and then translating that. Given your circumstances, had you had maybe different circumstances and gone a traditional route of college, you probably wouldn't have had the early success that you did within the sales space. So everything, I guess, happens for a reason, right?
Yeah, and I think that there's something that's interesting to contemplate and think about. We are often, we often talk about generations, right? So we talk about the baby boomers or Gen X, or we talk about the millennials, or we talk about, anyway, you get the idea.
Sure.
Gen Z and so forth. And I think that, is a little bit unfair to everyone that you want to talk to about. If you're a Gen Z and you get pegged, as this certain situation, or you're a millennial, I think that principles of truth are, they transcend generations. And so that's why I spent a little time talking about work ethic, that throughout the history of the earth, work ethic, has been something that's been a critical factor of success, and that there's no free lunch. And so whatever generation we come from, one of the eternal principles is there's no free lunch. And so if we really want to get what we want, we're going to have to be willing to work for it and sacrifice for it.
Yeah, I love that. That's great. And so did you ever end up going back to finish school, or did you go straight into founding your first company after the sales experience?
So good question, Chase. So actually my career took off like a rocket ship, like I said, and I traveled quite a bit. And so connecting, back in the day, they didn't have online school, so you actually had to show up. And it was actually tough to put it together. So I put together about 3 years. And when I sold my first business in the middle 90s, I had the opportunity I could have done whatever I wanted to do. And I thought about going back to school, and I thought, you know what, there's nothing that they're going to teach me at this point in an undergraduate that I haven't learned and self-taught myself, either through the early education process that I went through. I read hundreds of books, of the best books, literally hundreds of the best books. And so I already knew the books that they would have me read. Anyway, I ended up actually stopping the world and researching and writing and writing my own book. So I took about 3 years off from work after I sold my first company.
Yeah, and I want to touch on that a little bit later. And I think you bring up a good point about self-education and experience giving you that education that perhaps you formally, missed out on because of whatever circumstance. But I think sometimes people can get caught up. At least I did a little bit I did the accounting program at BYU. And as you're aware, very regimented, very structured. There's kind of a direct flow into a certain career path that exists within that program. And I think it's a really good balance to step back sometimes and realize, okay, I'm in a formal education setting, but that doesn't mean that I can't get experience elsewhere from books or from mentors or from other places. And so I think that's great, Scott. So then you mentioned you started your first company. Tell us a little bit about that.
So my partner was about 17 years older than me. So I was 29. He was 46. He had a big operations background. I had very little in the way of operations. I'd been a general manager, so I did some P&L and I did some, supply chain and so forth. But I really didn't yet understand, the side of being like a seasoned CEO. That just wasn't the case. Sales was still my biggest background, and so I came in and ran all of sales, and he ran all of operations. And we had developed a brand, medical and safety products for business and industry. We had about 150 distributors across the country that we developed over about 9 years, and they had exclusive rights to a certain territory, and so it was distributorships, a little bit like franchising, but not. And so we had about 10 stores that we operated, or 10 locations that we operated ourselves. I took care of all of those, and then later in 1994, about 6 years into the company, I took over as the president and chief operating officer. And so I did spend a lot more time in the operations side, but still mostly on the sales side with our distributors and with our direct reps. Anyway, we grew the company and had some good success. I wouldn't call it like a home run, but we got approached by Cintas, the uniform people, and we sold our business to Cintas. They were at the time about $1 billion. Today they're about $8 billion, I think.
Wow. And so this was this Life and Safety Products, was that the name of the company?
Yeah.
And just to clarify, you're wholesaling health and safety products into, was it medical facilities, or what were the actual products?
Business and industry. So we had it was, I wouldn't call it like a really sexy business, but it was profitable business.
Sure.
So we sold things like first aid kits and all of the bandages, over-the-counter medicines that were prepackaged that you would use in industry, and we would sell the accounts, and then our people would go in and replenish the what was used. So it was a sales and service model, and we also did a lot of training, in first aid and CPR and OSHA, all kinds of safety training, forklift driver training. I mean, you name it. So hand protection, head protection, clothing, hearing, everything that was in that particular realm. We handled those products.
Makes sense. And was that based in Utah?
No, it was based in Kansas City.
In Kansas City, okay.
Yeah, it was based in Kansas City, and then we were spread throughout the United States.
Got it, okay. And that was, so sold in 97?
Yeah.
Okay. How long, you were 29 when that started, how long was that run?
It was a 9-year run. So
9-year run, okay.
Yeah, 38 when I sold the company, and it was interesting. I never anticipated it. You don't start out thinking that, you're going to sell a business, and at least I didn't at the time. And I just thought we were going to grow the business. We were making, when you start out, it's like, okay, what are we going to pay ourselves? I'm the national sales manager of a company. I have, this back in '88, I have a $75,000 salary, which that's a big salary back in the day.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
And now I got to work for 40, because we've got to control our expenses. I still have the same 3 kids. I still have the same 2 cars payments. I still have the same house payment. And so it's a big jump. It's a big risk. I opened up a line of credit on my house, debted my credit cards, and then we worked diligently. We built some early success. We got an SBA line of credit for about $600,000 within the first year and a half or so, and then we were able to start rapidly paying that off. Became very profitable, and so it's like for the first 3 years I'm sitting here, living very, very poorly. But then 3 years into it, I think we raised our salary to about 60. And then the next year we raised it to like 75. And the next year it's at 90. The next year to 110. And then the year we sold, we were like 130 or 140 or something like that.
Yeah.
So we were, paying ourselves for the time, good money. And when we got approached by Cintas, that was like, wow, never thought about this part. So that opened up a new world for me, opportunities, and there weren't a lot of people, a lot of peers at that time. I didn't know people that had sold companies. I knew some wealthy executives of bigger companies, but anyway, so it's an interesting time.
Yeah. I do want to talk about your transition from your sales role to starting this company, because it sounds like you were doing very well. You had risen in the ranks. You were probably making pretty good money in a sales position. What was it about, wanting to take that risk? You basically, sounds like you leveraged your house. You swiped your credit cards. You were kind of putting it all on the line to get life and safety products off the ground. Why take that risk? Why not just, keep making money and doing sales?
I sort of, when I was 25, I sat down and wrote down some of my life's goals and values. So I had 7, and one of them was to build my career around building my own company. So I didn't want to be in a position where, I was beholden to somebody else, that I could have the opportunity to make it or not make it on my own. And so that was something that I had thought about for a period of years before I actually did it. And I talked with my wife about it. I told her that there was risk involved, but how much risk? It's not like it was a stupid risk. It was like I had already built 3 sales territories from scratch. That's what this was going to be. And so I didn't think it was particularly risky. And of course it was, but I didn't think it was particularly risky. And I went out that very first year and sold $1 million, and within 18 months we'd sold, almost 2 million in new sales, and it just kept growing from there. So
yeah,
I hired reps around me. I trained them. I actually developed a very sophisticated sales system around sales. I do things today, for example, that you won't read in any books. I've thought about writing a book, but I know how much effort it takes to write a book, so I haven't decided to do it. But the idea that, you know, of what selling really is, if we had more time, and I could answer it briefly, but just suffice it to say that there are things that I do that I don't see in Fortune 500 companies, not in any startups, and they really help scale companies faster.
Yeah, it's great. Well, it sounds like it was a risk, but a calculated risk. You're betting on yourself. The experience that you had makes a lot of sense. So when you had that first exit, Scott, in '97, you mentioned it wasn't quite a massive home run, but were you at a point there in your life that could you have kind of sailed off into the sunset, or did you start thinking, okay, what's next? What was your mentality?
You know, at the time, a little bit naive, I thought maybe I could have sailed off into the sunset. And if I was willing to, you know, live, you know, on 80 or 90,000 a year, I could have sailed off into the sunset and never looked back. So I could have you know, just had a modest house. I mean, a nice house, but a more modest house.
Mm-hmm.
And I could have never worked again.
Sure.
But I knew that was not going to be the case. But I also knew I had a lot of time, you know, to be able to decide what I wanted to do. So
got it. Makes sense. And so you alluded to it earlier, and I know you're an author of 2 books, Where Have All the Profits Gone? And Do the Mormons Have a Leg to Stand On? After that period of the exit, is that when you started working on Where Have All the Profits Gone?
Yeah. So this was something that was a long-time interest of mine. You know, I've been a questioner. I'm not one of those individuals that, you know, is just somebody tells me something, I say, oh yeah. Or even when my parents said, you know, this is what we believe, this is why we should believe it. I've never been that way. I've always been an individual that had to, you know, look underneath the covers, around the corner, underneath the hood. And so I had the time, and there was a whole set of circumstances around it. And I started researching early Christianity. I read all of the pseudepigrapha, all of the Apocrypha, all of the Dead Sea Scrolls, all of the Nag Hammadi library, and 100% of all the early Christian library that was translated into English. Wow. And wrote the book, it was sort of a non-denominational book called Where Have All the Profits Gone? And it really, you know, was built on the premise of, you know, how did things start? You know, on the science side, you know, we can look back and we can say, well, wait a minute, you know, everybody says that the earth is only, you know, that's religious, the earth is 6,000 years old, when in fact we know it's billions of years old. How does all that work out? And so one of the things that was interesting to me in all the research is you find that although humanoids have been around for a long time, actually, a couple million years or whatever, a long time, the first written languages you can only find, you know, 5,500, 6,000 years ago. And it's like they suddenly emerge. And so that it's very interesting to contemplate that. And so if you believe in the story of Adam, which of course I do, then you have to ask yourself the question, well, what happens after the fall? You know, what does God tell Adam? Where can we find that? You know, did he, you know, take a deck of cards and fan it out and say, pick a plan, any plan will do? Those are some of the questions that were on my mind. And so I wanted to understand the nitty-gritty of all of it, you know, and so that's why I did the project in the first place. And so it's a historical, theological book that starts with Adam and goes through the 19th century.
Very interesting. And where is that available to buy?
You can get it on Amazon. It's published. The second printing just came through Cedar Fort in the last few months, actually.
Okay.
So it's still available on Amazon, and it's a dense read. In fact, I have a funny story. I was reading the manuscript to my wife, and this is back in like early 2000s, 2001. And she looked at me and she said, well, Scott, I can tell that this is a book that I probably won't be reading. So you have to have an appetite to go deep. It's well-researched, well-documented, well-footnoted, and tried to help, people see that there's massive thought that's gone behind it.
Yeah, I love it. It sounds very interesting. And for you, from your background, it's pretty unique that, you're entrepreneur, sales, and then author of such a dense scholarly type text. So very, very impressive. I guess shifting back to the business side, I just looking high level through kind of your resume and your LinkedIn, I saw, was your next business venture with Best Vinyl, or was there something in between?
Yeah. So my second business was actually a company that originally started out, we named it Planet Salvage.
Okay.
And I was the founder and CEO of the company. And Planet Salvage's mission was to bring together the supply chain of the property casualty insurance companies, the collision repair shops, and the salvage recyclers to bring efficiencies for procuring alternative parts to repair vehicles for the insurance industry when they decided not to total loss the car, but instead to repair it. So a quick example that I always used was back in the day, 25 years ago, if you went to get your car fixed, or if the insurance company was going to fix the car, they sent it to a collision repair shop. There was really two options. You could send out a request, a phone and fax program to maybe 3 to 5 salvage yards, and they didn't have any sophisticated real time. Because you got to think about it, it's like 140 million parts that are flexing every day. Mm-hmm. And so to keep track of all those parts, I mean, there's really no good reliable systems, even today, that do that perfectly well. And so in real time, we created a network of like 3,500 salvage yards, and it was sort of like a bid ask. And so within 2 minutes, instead of having 3 to 5 quotes, and there wasn't any alignment between the insurance industry and the collision repair shops, because the collision repair shops made more money selling new parts than they did used parts. And there was no transparency, no tools that the insurance industry used, and they were always putting their thumb on the collision repair shop. If they wanted to be a most favored nation repair shop, then they had to toe the line, so to speak, no pun intended, but they had to, keep, doing it for less and for less and for less. And so there was a difficult spot, for the collision repair shop. But instead, our solution would allow you to go out and within a couple minutes, you could have 50 quotes with a real-time price. You knew it was in stock. You could push a button, it would ship that day. And so it was a huge, value prop. But one of the things that I didn't realize is that when I started the business, that the insurance industry wasn't going to adopt this, notwithstanding how well we could serve it and save them money, until the whole industry went wireless. Mm. Well, as it turned out, that just started, in the year 2000, 2001, and who knew how long that was going to take? As it turned out, it was like 7 years. Yeah. It was a good long time. Yeah. So not knowing that, I decided to, I had an opportunity to buy 50% of the vinyl fence company. Had a great partner and who knew that industry well. I knew the business side really well. I had some capital to help grow it. And so I turned the what we later called APU Solutions, stands for Alternative Parts Utilization, over to my head of sales, and he reported directly to the board, and we kind of coached him up. Over the years, that company got profitable in about 2007, about the same time that I actually sold the vinyl fence company, which was it was really early 2003, and we sold it in early 2007. So within 4 years, we built the largest vinyl fence company in the country. And so we were doing about 21 million in sales.
Wow. So in terms of the investment into the vinyl company, And I guess into APU as well, which is what you mentioned, the collision repair technology. What capital did you use? Was that the capital from life and safety products, or did you raise money? How did you acquire 50% of the defense company?
So the capital came from the proceeds that I made at Life and Safety to buy my interest in Best Vinyl, and then I put up the first $500,000 for APU Solutions. We ultimately, and this is the story of entrepreneurship. You have no idea what's going to happen along the way. I told my partners that hard things were ahead. I had no idea what they were going to be, but there were lots of things we didn't yet know, and we were going to find that they were difficult to deal with. So my early partners were really impatient. It was like I'd been fundraising for a month and didn't have the capital in the door yet. And they were worried because they had put in small amounts of capital, $50,000 to start, where I had put in 10 times that amount. And so I actually started the business on January 14th, 2000, and on February 28th, had a letter of intent for $8 million to build the company.
Wow. And this is APU.
This is APU Solutions. Yeah. And then we signed that it was what's the word I'm looking for? Anyway, it was a solid LOI. It wasn't, we could take it to the bank.
Yeah.
So we actually closed that on April 13th, 2000. So now what was interesting and wonderful and terrible about that whole situation was we closed that on the same day that the tech market dropped 318 points, and it was the beginning of the end of the internet bubble. And so we only got the first $1 million.
Oh, wow.
And the other $7 million, they came back to us and said, sorry, we're not doing this. You can have the first $1 million, with no equity loss, in exchange, but we're not, going to follow through. Mm. And it's not like you have money to go sue. We could have sued. But then how are you going to run your business when you're spending money with lawyers? Mm-hmm. So, and then worse than that, the next month I went for my 20th wedding anniversary to France and Italy. And in the middle of that, I got a call from, towards the end of that, one of my partners called up and said, well, 3 of the partners, they came in to the bank and they took out all the funds that they put in, and they've left us with, a very de minimis amount of money in the bank. And so I'm coming back. And it's not a great way to end your 20th wedding anniversary. But I came back and I stood in front of our, at the time, 9 employees. And this is where leadership comes into play. And I said, we don't have a lot of money in the bank, but I can tell you this, we will raise the capital. We are going to take this company to the finish line. So I invite you to enjoy the journey with us. We're going to get there. And anyway, it was a positive. As a matter of fact, I'm sorry, there were 16 employees at the time, but 9 of the 16 were with us to help profit, from the sale when we sold years later. So there's a lot to be said about leadership, and that's not also a trait that's not, you're not born with it. It's something that's learned, and usually through a lot of difficult experiences like this one. So I went and raised the capital, and we'd run out of money like 5 times. And I remember sitting in front of a group called the Bi-State Investment Group. And it was the Kansas and Missouri angel investors. And after the presentation, my partner said, Scott, were you nervous? And I said, nervous? What are you talking about? I never get nervous in front of people. And he said, Scott, I think you were nervous. You were shaking. No, I was not shaking. You're full of baloney. Anyway, he said, Scott, no, you were shaking. And I held my hand out there. And I said, see, it's not shaking. And it was shaking. And I went to the doctor and he said, Scott, you're just freaked out. So I started exercising more like crazy. And that got that under control. Ended up raising the capital. And so ended up actually partnering with 3 really, really impressive, wonderful investors. They became good friends. One was the former CEO and chairman of Western Auto before it was Advanced Auto Parts, when it was doing a couple billion before he sold in the late 80s. Another was the father of venture capital in Kansas City. Another had been the founder of Tires Plus. They'd sold for a few $100 million. Anyway, so I had really good partners. And so we just fed the company, the 4 of us, as it needed it over the first 6 or 7 years, and till it got to profitability.
Yeah.
And then we had a nice exit in 2012. But notice that I had already, built and sold Best Vinyl by the time the tech company got profitable. So
yeah, I was going to ask how you managed to your time, because you're in the middle of raising capital, starting up APU, and then you decide to invest and buy into a vinyl fence company, kind of a pivot, right?
Well, I felt like, listen, this technology stuff is all new, and it's taken a toll, on me, both financially and, mentally and emotionally. It's like, oh my goodness, this has been a ride so far. But I had my investors in place, and so I left operating that company in 2002 because I had that all in place, and finished my book because it kind of went in 2 tranches. It took me 1.5 years. Then I started the business. Then I left it alone for about 2 years. And then after I had everything, in a good place with APU Solutions in terms of how we were going to fund the company and lead it, then I finished the book, and then I started Best Vinyl and with a partner, or purchased. It was in its infancy. It was a year old. It had done just less than $1 million in sales, and so, like I said, I had a good, experienced partner, and then we actually brought on a couple of others, junior partners, great people, and so we had a wonderful exit in 2007, just ahead of the economy cratering in 2008 and 9.
Good timing.
Yeah,
that's amazing. I was going to ask Scott, life and safety products, you're doing health and safety materials and products, and vinyl fencing, collision repair, pretty diverse, right? I mean, How do you, and now with RevRoad, which we'll talk about here in a second, but how do you think about, executing or investing into ideas? How do you determine what would make a good, idea or concept?
So I always first look at a leadership team, period, because leaders will always figure it out and have a way to pivot. I had noticed that about myself, that, you know everything all at once. You stumble, you make mistakes. I always tell people I made my $10,000 mistakes, my $100,000 mistakes, and unfortunately, yes, my million and multi-million-dollar mistakes, because that's part of the learning process. So I look at a team hard. I look at the marketplace of a product and how big the opportunity is, and I back into it. I'm not a big fan of TAM, SAM, SOM, and SUM, and so forth. I'm just not. I like to back into how big the market is. For example, I was visiting with someone this morning and asked him how big the marketplace was, and he said, well, it was in the senior care area, and it was software for that industry. And he says there are currently 2 million beds, and there will be 3 million beds by 2030. I said, well, how much do you charge a bed? He said, well, $25. I said, well, okay, so your market is 3 million if you take 2030. 3 million times 25 beds. That's your market. If you got the whole thing, that's what it is. And that helps me think about if it's interesting to me or not, if it's big enough, because I know they're not going to get all the market. And so I have to back into it and say, well, what if they got 10% of the market? Would that still be interesting? And if it is, then I might be interested, in investing. So I look at the team, I look at the space, I look at the product and its key differentiators, and what, makes it a blue ocean strategy. Those are some of the primary things I'm looking at.
That makes sense.
I'm sort of agnostic to whether it's SaaS or whatever else.
Yeah.
I'm interested in how big can it grow, and does it have a leadership team that will be able to execute? And if they stumble, do they have a big enough market that they're still going to it's still going to be meaningful?
Sure, that's great. So you have your exit with APU in 2012, Best Vinyl in 2007, 2008. At that point, again, going back to the question, sell it to the sunset or do something else. When it looks like the next step was Omadi, is that right? And
no, actually, there was as I exited Best Vinyl, I had a portfolio company called Benefit Communication Insourcing in the insurance industry. So I took over as the executive chairman and really the CEO. My partner was the CEO, but he was a fantastic insurance guy, not yet seasoned in building a business. So there's a difference between, getting a ton of premiums from your sales to building a machine that can execute in the type of insurance business that we were. So BCI insources our people into the instead of outsource, we insource our people into the HR departments of large corporations north of, say, 2,000 employees, and we enroll them for free in their employee benefits. And for that, and we're experts in employee benefits and experts in their insurance plan, well beyond what you would see in an HR department. And for that, we get to see their people every 18 to 24 months and sell them ancillary benefits that their plan doesn't cover. And so instead of having take rates of 15 to 18%, ours are more like 60%. And so that company, I would set up the systems and processes and repeatable best practices. We were working with a large insurance broker, multi-billion-dollar insurance broker. And so we were doing maybe $7 million in premium then, but today, business, I'm still the second largest shareholder, and we're doing about $100 million in premium. So we've grown massively. And then in 2010, the dean of the business school asked me to come and run the Center for Entrepreneurship at BYU. So I said to him, Gary, I got my own business. He said, well, Scott, would you pray about it?
Yep.
We think you should be doing this. Anyway, so I decided to, we elevated my partner's son to be the president and COO. And I left to run the Rollins Center in 2010. And we were the first university in the world to adopt what we call the lean startup. So I had read a book in 2009 called The 4 Steps to the Epiphany by Steve Blank. And as fate would have it, I set up the program on 4 pillars. The first one being we need to have the best curriculum on the planet. Second, we need to have the best experiential program on the planet. Third, we need to have a competition, series that is exciting and invites people to participate in the process. And fourth, we got to have the best mentoring system on the planet. So as I thought about those 4 pillars, then I said, all right, I don't even know anybody here at the university. How do I sit down with the professors, which there was one, and some adjuncts and so forth. It was a really small program. And as it just so happened, Nathan Furr had just graduated with his PhD from Stanford and was a new professor at BYU and had written the book, Nail It, Then Scale It. And I interviewed him and told him I had evaluated the curriculum and that it didn't, seem very robust. And he said, well, frankly, Scott, I totally agree. And he told me about his book. I read it, and I'd already read Steve Blank's book. And I said, well, let's just flip the curriculum immediately. And John Richards was another professor there at BYU, fantastic entrepreneur. And so I brought him into the discussion, and so we changed our curriculum to the Lean Startup immediately. I had people telling me it was going to be a fad. I said, no, I don't think so. I don't think it's going to be a fad. So we were the first university in the world to adopt lock, stock, and barrel the Lean Startup. And then we started the International Business Model Competition. It started with 6 universities. 6 universities. It went to 600 universities, about 5,000 teams in 38 countries. And we were teaching the Lean Startup all over the world. And it really was getting BYU on the map throughout the world. So we were in the top 10 of all university programs for 10 years running straight. And I think the last 5 years that we were there, that I ran the program, our student teams exited with $13.5 billion, and they raised $3.5 billion in venture.
That's amazing.
Good program.
Yeah, no kidding. And so you were over that program for about a decade.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
In the middle of it, I had a former student that came to me and said, I've got this great software. He'd, since graduation, been in the towing industry and had built this towing software partially. And I did some investigation and said, yeah, I think that you got something here. I'd love to invest. So then I invested, and then he decided to take off and go to the Wharton School and get his MBA. So it kind of left me in a lurch, and I had to actually run the company. So there I am, running the Rollins Center until 5 o'clock and going home until 8 or 9 o'clock, and on the telephone with employees and partners, building that company. So, in like a year, we built to $100,000 a month in revenue, and I was able to get funding for it, brought a partner in to help me run it. And ultimately, then he did run it. Maybe a mistake. It's one of the great lessons that I learned in entrepreneurship was, at that time was, I had, even though I'd done technology business before, remember during the early stages of building the company, I was off doing Best Vinyl. And my partner was learning all the lessons of, the early stage software. And so I missed that part. And our software was good and really performed, but as we began to scale, it began to break. So it wasn't built on the right stack, and it wasn't scalable. So anyway, the outcome is still going to be pretty good, but it's not going to be what it could have been if perhaps I would have stayed and ran the company. But I'm not sorry. I went back for 4 more years to run the center, and we built an amazing program over that time. And I built a sort of a class. I called it Building Your Lean Startup. And I use that as a framework today, thinking about, as I've thought about science, and scientists decades ago would say that the earth was created out of chaos, and now we know that it wasn't created out of chaos. It was created out of order, and just not order, but sequence. If the universe doesn't know what it's going to become on day one and unfold every day like it has, these 13.8 billion years, you and I don't exist. And I've learned that companies are built out of sequence as well, order and sequence. And so one of the things I'm sure about is that I'm not here on earth to see how many chips I can put on the table. I'm happy to have some, so it affords some opportunities, particularly helping others. which is more important to me than stacking chips, so to speak. But it's allowed me to understand the startup world like a small handful of people across the United States maybe understand it. And
right.
So I understand, I call it the startup genome, and going from early stage product development roadmaps all the way through scale.
Yeah, and that kind of leads into RevRoad, which we'll touch on briefly as we wrap up here. But RevRoad is your current full-time gig, I guess you could say. Tell us a little bit about that, your startup incubator. I am curious, where is the capital coming from? Is that your personal capital? Are you helping to raise capital around these ideas and these new entrepreneurs that are coming to you to pitch?
So RevRoad and RevRoad Capital, the same company, two different divisions. RevRoad Services is a combination of incubator, accelerator. Instead of a 3-month gig like you might find with Y Combinator, it's a 2-year gig. And we've gotten pretty sophisticated about it. When I came about over 3 years ago, it was not as well developed, and there were some challenges, just like any startup with it, that I noted, and so I helped my partners make some shifts. They're great partners, incredible people, and then once we had gotten those things kind of put together, then 4 of us raised funds, capital over the last year of 22, 23. We all put in our own capital, and we raised capital from RevRoad investors and from others, throughout the Western United States generally. So we raised the largest debut seed fund in 2022.
And what was the size, if I can ask?
$61 million.
Okay, wow.
And during the toughest year of fundraising for decades.
No kidding. Awesome. So $60 million, and you are right now you're actively deploying that as
yes.
you get approached by these early entrepreneurs and concepts. And I guess how much have you deployed to date, and what are you looking for right now?
We've deployed about $12 million.
Okay.
And so we have some targets right now that we're going through diligence on. We're happy with the companies that we've invested in so far. I sort of have a thesis that companies don't fail because they don't have enough money. They fail because they don't have enough know-how. And so while we don't want to operate in any way, shape, or form their company, we have no interest in that, of course. We know that every CEO has holes in their resume, and that if we have the capability of coaching them, through some of those holes, and of course, sales is a big part of mine, and so I have a system for sales. I call it the sales playbook, and I use that to help our companies to think about scaling up a little more sophisticatedly. So we help them wherever they have need. We know that it's really scaling the founder that makes all the difference. They'll scale the business.
Yeah, that's right. I love it. Well, that's incredibly interesting, exciting what you guys are doing. Last couple of questions, Scott, and we'll wrap up here. Just in terms of, we've talked a lot about advice, but leading the Rollins Center, your own experience, the multiple exits you've had, and this is a tough question to answer, but just in terms of advice that you would give, perhaps advice you give to the companies you invest in, but if there's one, maybe 2 things that you'd say, hey, here's something that you should really watch out for as a new entrepreneur starting a business, anything you'd share?
I would always, tell entrepreneurs, and most of them that give it a go know a lot of these things, but they're in for a rough ride. They have to count the cost. They have to have a partner that is wholly supportive of the difficulty that lies ahead, and all of the problem solving that will have to be done along the way, and that there are things that they don't know, and that those things that they don't know can and will kill them. So I always tell them every day they should be asking what they don't know and then know it. So basically, when I lead teams today, I always ask them to come back every single week and tell me what they learned specifically that's going to help us build the business faster and more efficiently and better. And they're not let off the hook. They cannot come back to a meeting without saying, I learned this really eye-opening thing. There's so much to learn. And then there are clearly the basics. They have to understand an early stage product development roadmap. They have to understand implementation. How am I going to deliver the customer happiness that I promised? And I call that the first sale. And then how are they going to deliver the second sale, which I call customer adoption? That's client success team. How am I going to make that product so ingrained that it becomes impossible to get rid of the product? And so what are the processes and systems that you have to put in place to ensure that adoption really takes place, which eliminates, of course, churn. Then I got to think about marketing, and I think about marketing from, all the way from branding to building the right website that now includes your messaging, and then building your audience through Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and the like, influencers, blogging, videos, so on and so forth. And all of that has to contain your branding message, otherwise it falls flat. And then finally, your ad spend has to then follow that same format. And I always do that ahead of sales, because if I catch people at the beginning of the buyer's journey, then it's the education piece and the head banging piece, I call it. And instead, when there's a great marketing engine, we're catching most of our people, or a lot of our people, in the middle of the buyer's journey, which is much easier to predict closing around. And then I set up the sales engine and build the team as the company begins to scale according to need. So just some of those things are what I want early stage entrepreneurs to know.
Yeah, that's great. I did want to ask, Scott, how are you investing personally? You've had multiple exits. You've had financial success. Sounds like a good portion of your capital is with RevRoad. But maybe outside of that, is it mostly into venture? Is it into stocks and bonds? Is it into real estate? How do you look at your personal portfolio? It's
spread across, larger cap companies, some that I own and or own a good chunk of, and some in the early stage. I have, I don't know, maybe 30 angel investments, and I spread a lot, into like oil or mobile home parks or real estate. So I'm really looking at kind of the whole spectrum, because we live in a dangerous world with the Fed that it's difficult to predict, and that, a lot of us who know the underbelly of that don't like it very well. And so, yeah.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, last question for you, Scott, and we'll wrap up. I ask this to most of my guests. It's just to talk about, when you think about life and you think about success, why we're here. I guess, how do you define a life well lived, or how do you define success in your life?
So I'm a part of a group of about 20 of us that we meet about every 6 to 8 weeks, and we talk about all these issues. And they asked me years ago to give a presentation on how I measure success. And so it's the very question that you asked. So
I love it.
I actually have a whole presentation I did on it. And for me, the first one is my relationship with God and heaven. And that is, while most people, have relied perhaps only on feelings, are a big part of any religious experience. But I have looked underneath the covers of this more than really anybody that I know. And I have significant confidence that we are that this is a lot bigger than people understand. That we do have that there is a God and that there is a Heavenly Father, and so that's the most important thing to me is my relationship with heaven. And the second thing is my relationship with my wife, because people that are successful tend to forget those things, and those all have to be cultivated. So I spend copious amounts of time ensuring that those relationships are incredibly strong. Then I look at the individual relationship that I have with each child, and I basically say that their success is my success. And so I wanted to make sure that they did not feel that they got a free lunch, and that they didn't feel, they might, we might be wealthy, but I didn't want them to feel wealthy. I wanted them to feel a huge responsibility to, getting a good education. All 5 of my children did graduate from Brigham Young University, and some have advanced degrees and so forth. But I also have taught them how valuable experience is, that it's even more important than the education piece. And it takes both in order to interpret the complex world that we live in. And then, my health. And so health has always been a huge issue to me. And so my exercising and eating, and finally then I look at, money, but only from the standpoint of how I can use it to bless my family. I love to travel. It affords me to do that. And also then how can I help my fellow men? And so I'm involved in a lot of different things that allow me to give back and help me to do what I can with the means that I have to make a better world.
I love it. Well, a fantastic answer. I love the structure and thinking about it in those categories. It's really insightful and no better way to end. So thank you so much, Scott, for sharing your story and the insights that you brought today.
Thanks, Chase. Thanks for having me today.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for listening to The Chase Hudson Show. If you liked what you heard, please leave me a review and subscribe to this podcast. Reviews really help us to find better guests and to improve the overall quality of the show. If you'd like to connect with me directly or want to learn more about investing in real estate, send me a DM on Instagram at @officialchasehudson. Again, we really appreciate you listening, and we'll talk to you on the next episode.